that Israel had just invaded Lebanon. It was in the same month the conference was occurring. Okay, so it shows that within the logic of the lobby, right? It didn't matter. It didn't matter what was happening. They will pursue recognition of the genocide at all costs. Okay, now where the conservatism and the emergent fascism of the diaspora comes into play here is that you have to ask the question. They never stop to ask the question, what good is recognition from a white supremacist government? What good is recognition from a government that produces and uh, threatens and blackmails the world population with nuclear bombs and attacks its own citizens with attack dogs and fire hoses and drone warfare and surveillance, right? So like what good is recognition in that sense? Okay. So then it puts you in an automatically sort of conservative pull, because the genocide studies is very conservative. As an academic, Tamar, I know you know that it is a very conservative field. So yeah, it's like it cuts out the possibility of a radical alternative and just limits the horizon of Armenian political struggle to just lobbying to help the government or to get recognition, but it doesn't actually consider the kind of critical parameters of what that means, the implications of what that actually means, I think.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Other Armenias podcast. I am one of your co-hosts, Tamar Sharinian.
And I'm your other co-host, Milena Abrahamian.
We have a very exciting conversation today. But before we get to that, please go right now. It's right there. Go and click the like right now. Subscribe if you haven't already. Again, I'll give you a second. Go and click it right now. Go and click subscribe. And thank you. And if you enjoy the conversation, or if there's anything that you would like to give us feedback on, please also comment. Okay, today we have Garren Jansezian with us. Garren is a writer and a librarian based in Yerevan, and we are very happy to talk to him about our theme for today.
Thanks for having me.
So our theme for today is fascism. So this is a topic that is probably more relevant today than, like it just keeps becoming more and more relevant as we go. So why are we thinking of talking about this? Because we're seeing, I was saying before we started to record that fascism is on the rise, but it's been on the rise. So it's just kind of, we are seeing it manifesting more materially now in many ways. Just a few days ago, President Trump designated Antifa as a domestic terrorist organization. And that's just one of the kind of things that is manifesting in this moment. There are so many people who've been laid off their jobs for making comments about, I don't remember his first name, but this guy, Kirk, who was assassinated. And then we also know that all of this is very much connected to people being vocal about the genocide in Gaza and the censorship of that. So this is a topic that is, like, obviously, like all the things that I'm saying, there's a lot of things coming from the US, but obviously it's kind of reverberating globally. And And yeah, we're just curious about how these things are manifesting in other Armenias, the Armenia we know, that we are part of. Both Garren, our guest, and I are living in Armenia currently, but we know that this is not just something that is, an issue in the US, but it's also, or in other Western or non-Western contexts, but also in Armenia. So yeah, just curious about your thoughts on this topic, Garren. Maybe we can start with just a general, what does fascism look like today, whether in Armenia, in the diaspora?
Yeah, I think that's one of our most urgent tasks is really to define fascism, because it is somewhat of a nebulous thing that at times is historically specific, and at other times has general tendencies and characteristics that we can identify pretty easily, right? So I think, uh, at least in the American context, I think fascism is deeply related to, of course, white supremacy, racism, and the economic basis of these things, which is slavery, right? And I think where Armenians play a role here is because as we immigrated to the United States and Europe and places like that, um, Armenians were racialized at times, at first as non-white, and then at times as white, and whiteness being this kind of flexible, fluid social identity, right? That also has material consequences, but has a role to play in how fascism works. So I think since the first term of Donald Trump, for example, we've seen a resurgence of fascism globally too, right? But it's as a result, I think, in my opinion, as deindustrialization occurs, as structural adjustment has hit in places like Armenia, right? I think in the 90s, we saw Armenia and the entire like former Soviet world just become free market Wild West, okay? Or let's say the free market Wild East. And this totally dislodged all social relations, right? Because suddenly a new capitalist class emerged. And with them emerged identities, national identities that had been fomenting under Soviet rule, right? Specifically in Armenia, let's say, as literature began to be produced under the Soviet Union and things like that, and the Karabakh issue kind of came up at different forms. And then once the rule of the previous regimes was established, let's say Kocharian, and then specifically the Republican Party, the Hanrapetakans, they specifically subscribe to something called Serakonitun, which is an ideology, a kind of political platform developed by Garren Jansezian, who was a former Tashnag and who was active in the First World War and the First Republic in Armenia as a sort of militant. And once Sovietization occurred, he fled, and he's kind of known legendarily, Milena, I'm sure you know this, as like the person who saved Sunik from, ensuring that Sunik was part of the modern Republic of Armenia. Although I'm not, based off things that people I've talked to and things that I've read, I'm not sure if history actually bears that out. But that's something we can talk about in the future. So once Nujde left Armenia, he eventually ended up in Bulgaria and different places, and he eventually ended up in Nazi Germany. And him, alongside another milieu of Armenians, such as Dro, I think his full name is Drastamat Konanyan, or something like that, and a couple other like Armenian intellectuals who were trying to propagandize Armenians into supporting Nazi Germany. Okay, by saying that Nazi Germany will help liberate Soviet Armenia. And they were also at the same time trying to prove that Armenians are of Aryan stock and that they should be, not targeted by Nazi Germany and so forth. So they did this in a paper called Azad Hayastan, which is there's scans of it on the National Library of Armenia's website. So like you can read these writings, and you could the date of publications are very intriguing. It's like during wartime Nazi Germany, which as we could all imagine is a very strict time for censorship. So it's kind of an interesting way to see how this stuff was being allowed to be printed right at that time. And they were trying to organize Armenian.
So can I ask a clarifying question? Is it so they're being published in Soviet Armenia or abroad and then maybe later bought?
No, they were published in Nazi Germany.
Yeah.
And I think they were trying to circulate them in the occupied territories and like occupied parts of Europe and stuff like that. Yeah. And another side note about this, something interesting that I learned is that one of the gentlemen who was part of this this milieu of, let's say, sort of fascist or quasi-fascist Armenians, when in occupied France, there's the Nubar Library in Paris, which is one of the older repositories of Armenian, let's say, literature and writings and stuff in Europe, and which was started, by the way, by a genocide survivor, but in occupied France, one of these gentlemen, these sort of quasi-fascist Armenians, went to this place to plunder it, basically, and bring it back to Nazi Germany. So the person who runs this library, he came and spoke at the university that I work at, and he told the story to us. And what happened was the director of the library, who was at the time one of the genocide survivor, he was still alive, he handpicked stuff that was like, okay, kind of replaceable, wasn't very valuable, things like that, for him to take. Well, he was actually hiding the good stuff. And now, even today, the director of that library is being contacted by places across Eastern Europe or former Soviet Union who have those items that were taken by the Nazi police and the German military at that time. So that's a brief little historical aside, but all that to say is that Nejde has a prominent role today in sort of modern Armenian national identity as someone who was a statesman, but his kind of fascism and his racism, because Tsera Chronotun kind of basically translates to race worship. And it's very mystical, he was kind of like this mystical fascism it's not very interesting to read, but if you read it, you'll immediately understand what his influences are, which is that period of time of fascism, right? So that's the kind of historical thing. But one aside I would add is that Mussolini originally coined fascism as corporatism, right? To kind of understand the function economically of fascism, right? Which I think, as George Jackson would write, is the ultimate goal is to destroy all revolutionary consciousness and completely subjugate, working people to whatever it is the state and the parties that control the state want. So I think that's something to keep in mind too, especially as like in the US, for example, both of the major political parties are completely corporate run, basically. And corporate money is just awash in politics. And they guide policy. So from that point of view, it's hard to not see the US as a corporate state, And then with the official declaration today, it's like official policy now. The United States is opposed to Antifa.
It's that the fascism is based on the bundle of sticks that is harder to break. So if you have, if you have a bunch of twigs, each twig is easy to break. But when those twigs come together in unity, they become unsnappable, right? But then that makes any possibility of there being individual twigs, being other ideas, other, possibilities of existence outside of the frame, because that assumes weakness, and weakness must be completely exterminated, right, within fascist ideas. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that speaks also to the character of fascism, is that it's a mass politics, right? It strives to get as many people as possible involved in the movement of fascism, right? So, as in Nazi Germany, as in Mussolini's Italy, as in Franco's Spain, okay, and as in the way the white working class works in America, and that they are ready to, receive what's called the psychological wages of whiteness, right? Which is this idea that they are benefiting from the system of capitalism and racism, right? Even though they are not actually, compared to the people who are, the elite whites, right? And they get to be, they do the dirty work, so to speak, which is, target free speech. They target, they're doing the book bannings, which is this, the podcaster who was killed, championed, by the way. And in America, there's this, for example, there's a group called Moms for Liberty, right? I think is the name of the group. And the Republican Party has done a good job of this in America, mobilizing grassroots activists in things as minor as school boards, right? Like local school boards, and getting these Moms for Liberty elected. And then they would begin to target leftist literature, queer literature, feminist stuff, things like that, and really attack at the schools and try to radicalize people on their base through that. So that's kind of been, that's another way to define fascism. It's always something mass. It tries to get as many people as involved as possible, and it borrowed that from Marxism. Actually, I'm not saying like there's similarities between the two, but it saw that this is the contribution of Marx and Lenin to Marxism, is that they saw that the working classes, the proletarians, are the ones who can make socialism happen. Okay, the fascists, because Mussolini was originally a Socialist Party member, he took this and tried to use the same thing to mobilize people. And
also the really important link between the actual corporations, right? It's not just some kind of metaphor or something. The actual corporations and fascism, right? So in 1933, there's this meeting that the Nazi Party has for global capital, right? So capitalists, major capitalists, so Ford and ThyssenKrupp and all of these major manufacturing companies at the time, where industrial capitalism was kind of at its height in the 1930s, were invited to this meeting where the Nazi Party pretty much told them, like, look, give us your money, and we will do it for you. We will get you free labor. We will crush the unions brutally. We will do everything we can to make you as rich as possible, right? And so this idea that, that capitalism emerges with liberalism and liberal ideas, that, capitalism comes out of like the French Revolution and ideas of liberty and so on, is partially true, but alongside that has always been forms of extreme violence, right? And that comes home to Europe in the 1930s, but that was always the reality of capitalism in the third world. That was always its reality, right? So, capital can only actually become capital, can only actually, thieve so much from the public and the commons if it crushes human life underneath it. And that is the only means through which it can happen. And fascism is its primary form, which, happened in the third world and then came home to roost, as in Cesar's terms, or in the boomerang, it came home.
you're both talking about like a past time. I just want to bring your attention to the fact that all of these like tech billionaire, like mostly dudes, were gathered around a table with Trump just a while ago, pledging their allegiance. Um, yeah.
Yeah, those tech guys basically bought the election. I mean, they not only do they have the capital, right, to buy the election, but they have the means to distort and frame the conversation, discourse, because everything is now online, on the virtual space, right? Not just through because uh, they're brilliant geniuses or whatever, but they can create an army of bots, right? To comment this and like that and retweet that and shift and frame the really margins of discourse. So it's extremely dangerous, especially there's people like Peter Thiel, right, who runs Palantir Technologies. And Palantir has one of the, they have many, many millions and millions of dollars worth of government contracts with the United States to produce surveillance, to produce, surveillance technologies, for example, border surveillance technologies, facial recognition, stuff like this, right? Drones or like refining drone technologies and targeting technologies and stuff like that. And Peter Thiel outright says, like, yeah, I don't think democracy is a thing. I don't think women should vote. You know, he grew up in colonial South Africa. I think in what is now Namibia. He grew up in a city where people still said "Hail Hitler" in like the 70s and the 80s as a form of greeting, right, in the mornings. Um, this is on Democracy Now. Like this is like open news. And yeah, so these are the people who run the show, I think, in the US. And not only that, but they have very dangerous views of the rest of the world too, because the technologies they produce, aside from the outright violent repressive technologies, military technologies that are on display, of course, in Palestine and in Sudan and elsewhere, right? And then the borders, right, of the Mediterranean, you know. Uh, Sorry, I think I lost my train of thought. They were, um,
The
yeah, they
violent
have,
technologies.
yeah, the violent technologies, but also like the worldview that they have, and also the fact that the technologies they have are putting people out of jobs. So in a moment of capitalist crisis is when fascism is at its most appealing, because it's such a radical alternative to liberalism, or like neoliberal thought. And this is why neoliberalism can't really contend with fascism, right? At the same time that it nurtures the conditions of its growth, it also doesn't take fascism seriously as a threat. It doesn't see it as a threat. And that's extremely dangerous, right? So this is why like even the Democrats, right, are joining the chorus of like, oh my God, so sorry about the podcaster who was killed. It's like it's a very dangerous slope, and uh, yeah, it's a frustrating situation to view from here, and we're also seeing the other side of it, because I think something again important about fascism and important in defining fascism is its international character, and Tamar, you alluded to this in the sort of origins, right, of colonialism, colonial violence, then being pushed back, recoiling back into Europe. And now we're seeing similarly in America where the genocide against the Palestinians, okay? And I think something's important to frame here too. Is it's not just the genocide against the Palestinians in Gaza, right? It's the genocide against Palestinians in Palestine, right? If we view it as a continuous process from 1948 on, that has momentary major surges and like dramatic violence, right? So we're seeing how once October 7th occurred, and then the beginning of the Israeli um, operation, it was under Biden that all the attacks against the universities, against intellectual freedom, against students, against Palestinian groups, all of that began under Biden. He authorized the operation, first of all, Israel, okay, and then he totally stood aside and encouraged the witch hunts against the universities. So it's a bipartisan process how it works out that way. And so Democrats have done really nothing to stop it. And that's part of the way that liberalism nurtures it. At the same time that it's vulnerable to the dangers that fascism poses, it also creates it. It's like fascism grows out of the bosom of liberalism. I think you could argue, right?
So
Yeah.
if we were to sort of bring it to to Armenia, where we both are located, and sort of I think that since the so-called revolution here, it's been like I think that Armenia has become even more liberalized, right? And the sort of what is the model you look to? It's the West, it's Europe, it's Europe, but it's the US. So what does it mean that there's this kind of liberalism that is so also intertwined with fascism that is being sort of propagated here, brought here? And like how do you see this manifesting?
Yeah, it's been a very enlightening time here because I really didn't know too much about this Armenia as a state or as a country before I got here. But as I've got to live here and see certain things, and because it's still such a massive time of upheaval, in society wise, you can see that, the baseline of Armenian politics is nationalism, right? Doesn't matter if they're a civil contract, if they're Hanra Petakans, it's always nationalism, right? There's different kinds of nationalisms, right? There's the nationalism of the church, which is like a very like backwards, like horrific social conservatism, right? And then there's the nationalism of civil contract, which in the name, right? Civil contract, it's like a liberal, more civic nationalism that tries to encourage people to be upstanding citizens and stuff like that. Now, my view of this is very influenced by Garren Jansezian, who was one of your guests, also a great episode, and who has said in the past too that Armenia is an ethno-state. It began as an ethno-state, and there's the argument to be had that all states are ethno-states, right? So Armenia's as an ethno-state, it's nationalism as the baseline, an ethno-nationalism as the baseline, and then the initiation of liberalization from the 90s onwards, and then intensified as civil contract has come into power since 2018, it has not answered the social question in Armenia, or the major social questions of Armenia that the revolution had purported to solve, right? Getting rid of the oligarchy, it hasn't done that. Giving back property to people, it hasn't really done that. Like, okay, there are some cases, maybe it's won back. Employment, poverty, all these things are still plaguing the country. On top of, right, the threat of war and the threat of violence and stuff like that from Azerbaijan, from the state of Azerbaijan. So the thing is that in Armenia, I think the opposition is very incompetent, and they still have the stench of the former regime. So I wrote a piece about this for EVN last year when there was the border demarcation in Kirans and Voskepar in the Tavush region. And there were spontaneous protests that came about in the town because the villagers were, they're upset. They're like, listen, we don't know if this border is going to take away our pastoral land, if the border is going to be right in our backyard, things like that. And then what happened was the head of the Tavush diocese, this Bagrat Gastanyan, took part in the protests, okay? And the opposition immediately backed him, okay? So in their opportunism, they kind of saw spontaneous protests done by villagers and tried to take it over, okay? And then they did this whole thing. They marched on the capital, they marched on Yerevan. They had a rally. He was late to the rally, and then he's late to the rally, and he's like, the government should resign in 40 minutes. 40 minutes passed by. He said the government should resign in 2 hours. The government should, and so on and so on. So these are the far right traditionalist conservatives, right, who are backing him, the former regime, the Kocharians and the Sarkisians and stuff like that. But I think people, they think that people in Armenia are stupid, right? That they think that they don't see what's going on. Armenians are not stupid. There are many things they're not stupid. So they have seen right past this. And this is why that gentleman and the broader movement that he sort of represents doesn't enjoy popular support. Okay? Because of that, and they don't have anybody charismatic or brilliant enough, let's say politically, to be able to rally people enough to. So, however, that doesn't mean that they're not trying. They are trying to do that, and they represent, the far right. They represent, what's happening in Georgia, basically, maybe turned up even higher to a higher level of repression and things like that. Could occur here if they were able to kind of take power. And then on the other hand, okay, you have the government, or you have the ruling party, let's say. And the ruling party has been trying to put out this new platform called Real Armenia, or Irakan Hayastan, I guess is the translation. And if you read the platform, it basically says the state is the nation. The state is a tool for prosperity for the people. The state is the key interest of the state is economic development. Okay, you see where I'm going with this? It doesn't elaborate on what economic development entails, which is as we've seen with the peace deal, right? It's an influx of international capital. Okay, rather than just solely Russian or let's say somewhere else, it's now Gulf petro capital. Okay, it's American capital, the kind of capital that doesn't like it when workers do this, or when roads get blocked, or when things happen. It's the kind of capital that's really like horrible, horrific. So that is not going to be agreeable to, I think, the sort of conditions that Armenians work in, and live in. So.
And I just want to note here real quick that this is exactly how Lenin defined imperialism, right? It's this kind of investment. So it's not just like, oh, maybe like we'll get some money, right? That investment within the liberal logic is a good thing. Whereas if you look at it from a materialist perspective, and we might say now, like in a world systems perspective, which I don't agree about everything with, but investment is basically takeover. Investment is control, right? And so that's what when they say like development, they're using a very an imperialist model of development that is now also termed neocolonialism. And you mentioned structural adjustment policies earlier, right? This is their kind of vision of what investment is going to look like.
Yeah, and I think the problem with the ruling party now too, and the sort of like far right street politics that have taken place in the last couple of years, is that there is no left alternative in Armenia currently, right? There is no left movement. Whatever existed from the street politics of 2018 is done. It's not here anymore, right? Because the people who led it are now part of the government, okay? Or because they're part of NGOs and the NGOs don't do anything, right? My perspective on NGOs, just as an aside, is very influenced by my experience in America, and I think NGOs kind of operate the same role, right, throughout the world, which is as the welfare state broke down and the state no longer started providing services, the NGOs came about to fill in those gaps and plug those holes. But they're a Band-Aid on like a gaping wound, right, on what's happening. And their ultimate bottom line is to get grants and to like reproduce themselves, right? So it's very and that on that side. And then on the other side, you have the social justice oriented NGO. right? And this archetype you can see all over the world. However, if you look at the social justice NGO, are the workers unionized? Are the people, are the staffers in the nonprofit treated well? Do they have benefits, right? Things like that. So you can see how they're inherently contradictory organizations, and they're not revolutionary organizations. That's also a very important factor, right? You can't mobilize and organize mass democratic struggle through NGOs. They can maybe be part of stuff. They can be part of campaigns for like, let's say, certain reforms and things like that, but they're not going to take that next step to kind of do the mass transformation. So because there's an absence of street politics and kind of militant radical organizing in Armenia, it leaves the threat of fascism to develop, because the only opposition, the only thing that counters the traditionalists in the streets is the state, is police. Okay, and it doesn't matter if the government is a campaign on progress and reform. If you bash somebody in the head with a baton, it's never good. Everyone is opposed to that. Like, people generally have a negative stance towards that, right? Especially if it's like, the optics of a priest, or like journalists, which the ruling party targets a lot. They target journalists, like frequently, actually. So those things will have people turn to political alternatives that have radical appeal. And that's the dual-sided thing of a crisis, is that like fascism is appealing, but also so is socialism, so is international revolution. Like that, those things are also appealing. But when it's not there, and fascism has the ability to kind of maybe take hold of consciousness, then people will go in that direction, I think, is what it seems like.
No, I think that's how it is. In the absence of an alternative, fascism, it's so easy. It's like how consumerism works in a way. It's like, do you have any other options but to consume? Right? So then you just consume, because there's no other fucking alternative. So I think fascism works like that.
Yeah. And just, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, this is like, Walter Benjamin's, the famous quote of "behind every fascism is a failed revolution." Right? And by that, like, he's getting at the way in which this energy of distrust, of rage, of anger, because capital creates so many social problems, is going to have to go in a direction, right? And it's either going to go toward revolution, right, and create a society in which people can actually live, or it's going to be usurped by fascism. It has to go in one of those directions, because liberalism is like I've been trying to think about this, in my more recent work, like what liberalism is: basically a politics made of an anti-politics. It's a politics that claims to be a political ideology, but actually is completely vacuous, because in it tries to, take some of this and that, both sides things, and really ultimately does not have its own actual cause. And so when in a context like in Armenia, where you have in power a liberal party, then either it's going to go in this way or that way, because people are fed up. Right. And that's the real danger. And, what we're seeing in the United States right now, which might be a little bit different than what we're seeing in Italy right now. But what we're seeing in Armenia right now is that in the United States right now is that there's a very powerful kind of movement to divert to the right. Right. And we don't see an equivalent, power that's shifting things to the left, which is extremely dangerous in a liberal context. And I think it's similar in Armenia right now. I mean, I would argue, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, Garren, and Milena. Both of you live in Armenia, but right now my sense is that in Armenia, the power really is in the center. It's in that liberal form, which cannot exist for very long. Right? Because that creates a lot of discontent, and it's going to have to go in one or the other direction. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think next year's elections are going to be a big proving ground for that sort of thing. I mean, the thing is, I think people in Armenia really do not want to see they refuse to go back, I think, to the previous state of affairs. Like they will not go back. So that gives me some confidence that they will go forward. But because there's the left is so, or like there is no left, it's hard to also grasp on that on that side of things too, which is difficult to see. But I think so, yeah, I think the idea of liberalism uh is a tenuous one because on the Real Armenia platform that Pashinyan and Civil Contract have created, they list liberalism as one of their platforms, and the whole document is basically just like liberal political philosophy. But I mean, this is like we go back to Marx, and he pretty much immediately strikes down liberalism by saying, there's no such thing as equality on the market, right? So like if we look at things in terms of the international market, right? Let's say Armenia, its GDP, I think it's around probably the same as Zimbabwe, for example. It cannot compete against the big imperialist nations, right? So the notion of like some international liberal order where there's freedom or sovereignty even is bunk. The same way, and that extends down to the individual level because that is how liberal governments operate, right? They view, and in Armenia too, right? They view it as, Armenians should, go start a tech startup or something, or get some hedge funds going, or like do this or that, right? So like the failure of the individual is attributed to their own action, which is the hallmark of liberalism, right? And that just doesn't hold true to the reality, right? Like you can't tell someone in America, and you can't tell a worker in America, let's say, or let's say a barista or something, and then let's say a bus driver in Armenia, you can't tell them they're not hardworking and that they're not successful because of a lack of effort or hard work. It's because the way that the system and structures are designed has to ensure that people are poor, right? Otherwise, the people at the top get no benefit out of it. Um, so I think in Armenia, but there is discontent, and there is not, let's say progressive discontent, or let's say a discontent that's nonpartisan, because in the last year there's been a pretty significant, it's a modest but a significant wave of strikes, right? Starts with Yerevan bus drivers who wanted more pay and wanted some more hours. They'd get one bathroom break maybe in a 12-hour shift, stuff like that. And the mayor of Yerevan, who is probably as unpopular as every other mayor of Yerevan, fired them. Just fired them, 40 of them outright. Called the strike illegal, branded them as criminals. Oh, they're taking money from passengers. They're not giving correct change, stuff like that. Branded them as criminals. By the way, the ruling government likes to do this. They like to scapegoat all the Gharabakhsis too for every other social problem, right? So there was the bus strike, and then there was the big strike at Zangezur in Kajaran. I wrote about that. Kanar Khudoyan from ePress wrote about that too. She covered. She was down there, and then another friend of mine, Garren Jansezian, also wrote a brilliant article about Kajaran, and that was the biggest strike there in 70 years. And they were not. They were saying like, listen, like we're being exploited as workers. We're being exploited as miners. The environment is also being destroyed, and we don't even know who this corporation is. We don't even know who owns it. They know that it's Russian before it was German, right? And then I think there's been some other strikes at other smaller mines, and just at the end of this is also to go back to international markets and the influx of capital. The same week that Pashinyan had a statement where he was kind of bragging about Armenia becoming a destination for labor migrants, a bunch of migrants in a textile factory in Ijevan, his hometown, went on strike, right? A bunch of Indian migrant textile workers being held at gunpoint. They had their passports confiscated. They walked out because they wanted their wages. They wanted, their freedom of mobility and stuff like that. So that's also part of the thing too. I think actually that we should take into account is that Armenia is a homogenous nation, and because of the pre-existence of ethno-nationalism and some sort of and the influx, obviously, the influence of racism too, is that they view foreigners with suspect. And because Armenia is now being, I think, opened to international commerce and trade and stuff like that, and like there's visas are being relaxed, it will be a place for, kind of as like a second world country, let's say. It will be a destination for migrants from other places to come and seek work, right? And the nativist traditionalist parties can try and take advantage of this and see like, oh, look how they're taking our jobs. The same thing that happens in the US, right? And so you have like poor Armenian taxi drivers who have more in common with a migrant Indian worker. They have more in common than they have with someone like Gagik Tsarukyan, for example, right? So that's also a critique. I think the very important anarchist critique of nationalism, in that nationalism, like whiteness, by the way, seeks to unite classes, right? It's like a cross-class alliance, and I think we have to reject that as part of, if there's like I think that's something that we have to reject, right? Is that kind of form of nationalism that says, oh, like all Armenians, we should have unity and stuff. It's like, no, I don't want seek unity with the church. I don't seek unity with the Armenian business owners, the Diaspora business owners, because they're of a functional class that are opposed to the most people in Armenia. But yeah, that's one of the kind of murkier routes to take. But yeah, I know Tamar, you asked Milena the same question too, so.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think it's this narrative that there, in terms of time, that Armenians here in Armenia don't want to go back to a time of the sort of the whoever was leading before that they're against, who is the opposition now, is a bit like sort of creating this illusion that as if what is now is not a continuation of that. And I think, it's in some ways, when I think about the progress of time in terms of sort of how things, in terms of like when you look at what is considered as good as progress, which is development, right? We just talked about what that means in terms of capitalism, liberal ways of life. I think that in that progression of time that we've had politically in Armenia, like I wouldn't say that things are better now than they were when there were these bad leaders, that oligarchs, that that we were trying to that we tried to oust, and I would say we failed because we have a ruling class right now that is to me, in some ways, I mean, I can't really I don't want to compare and say it's worse, but in terms of like the times we're in, I think they're not helpful just as much as whoever was before wasn't helpful either. So it's not something to compare. And I would say that it's actually, I think because of that, we're even more under sort of threat of becoming like under this wave of fascism more. I mean, not more, but it just is how it is. And I don't want to create a narrative where Armenians now care so much about, oh, let's just, as long as we don't go back to the former rulers. I think that, as you said, Armenians are not stupid. And I think they understand that it's all the same. And I would say that what's really important to continue doing, and maybe also noticing, are some disruptions that are beyond these particular cases of that you're speaking about, the strikes, but I mean, other ways of disrupting. I don't know how long it can, sort of sustain itself, but I really do believe, especially in the times of, artificial intelligence and like all of this, we were just talking about, how big of an influence all this technology has on creating narratives and yeah, like really influencing how people think. But I think I really do believe that human beings are just at least like 1% smarter if we have to compare with artificial, or like not smarter, but I hope that, you know, we are 1%, at least 1% smarter than um these technologies that are sort of trying to homogenize everything and make everything into um one one thing that is really like killing off any other alternatives, diversity. Anyway, I'm going off on a tangent, but I'm just yeah, I'm thinking about it from this in this way, because this oneness is also kind of part of that fascism, no? Like it's, yeah, it's trying to like make this, and you're right, we shouldn't be unified because it's like, isn't that what fascism is about? Unify under this one like very scary, dry, like void of life, or thing that is trying to void life. It's scary.
But I think that there is another kind of unity. And this is also where, like, you know, how I think that humanity is actually smarter than AI or mob mentalities that are being produced by some of these technologies is because what we have is a lived material reality, right? We have material conditions in which we live. And there's another kind of unity that comes out of the realization of our shared lived realities, right? Like Garren, you were saying that, you know, Armenian taxi drivers at some point, right, are going to have to reckon with and are going to realize that their interests are the same interests as the Indian migrant workers in Armenia, right? And that not just because they're both in Armenia and oppressed by the same owner class, but because as workers internationally, right, there is this unity because we are all screwed over by the same material conditions, right, which is very different from the fascist sense of unity, which is an ideological doctrine which basically is trying to instill a lie and then enforce it through violence, right? That sense of like, I know that I am in unity with others because I can see the ways in which we share these really shitty conditions, right?
Yeah, I just to Milena, to go to your point about how things have changed or how things have not so much changed since 2018. Yeah, because I think what's really key, I think something that doesn't in the diaspora, in diaspora analysis, and maybe somewhat here, but I think more so in diaspora, there's not an analysis of class really generally in Armenia. Like diasporans have no idea what class is like in Armenia, right? They don't understand that they're more of a higher class thing, and so there's no analysis of capitalism, right? But I think like fundamental stuff of analysis of capitalism is that how the state functions and what the role of the state is in a capitalist society is really important for us to consider, right? Because it doesn't matter under which order it's controlled by, right? Let's say, because the bourgeoisie is, or the ruling class, right? There's different tendencies, right? Like in Armenia, there's like this like kind of tech bro, neoliberal kind of class, and then there's like the traditionalist guys, right? There's like these different splits, and they have disputes. So right now, the the center kind of liberal faction is in control of the state. And the thing is, they can't change how the state functions, right? The ultimate functions of the state are to ensure that capitalism keeps going and capitalism keeps circulating, right? So what that means is, uh, you know, the mines produce, the workers work, and people get squeezed more and more. You know, the market's open, right? And the state is at the center of this, right? So liberal theories about like oh, the state is not, the state shouldn't be involved. It's the invisible hand of the market. That's complete nonsense. Like the state is in control and at the center of a lot of what happens. So the issue is that the far right segment of Armenia's bourgeoisie, let's say like Armenia's native bourgeoisie, is not in control of the state. So the state may not have the same kind of character of like mafia, which is how it was before, but it still functions as the state, which is ultimately to like keep capital flowing and the accumulation and the extraction flowing, which is a a violent process. And then at the same time, they're also it's also a non-violent process, right? They're maybe less likely to resort to means of violence because they can convince people through this or that way, discurt through symbols, through education, whatever, to buy in or to ignore or whatever. So yeah, I think uh, the thing with civil contract is that they can't change the way the state functions. They're dependent on the state because if their very existence depends on how the state works. But as they've learned in the last 7 years, reformism cannot change how a state works. Only a revolution can do that by either like abolishing the state or like instituting something else or whatever. So that's the fundamental of 2018, and part of also civil contracts mythology that they peddle, which is that they are revolutionaries. That 2018 was a revolution, but revolutions, to quote Malcolm X, revolutions are bloody. There's no compromise. It's a huge affair where like property relations are completely changed. That did not happen in Armenia. So because there is no analysis, let's say analysis of capitalism amongst the analysts of Armenia and stuff like that, they can't reconcile, I guess, the fact that like civil contract is not living up to it. It's not because they're like maybe a lack of trying or whatever. It's because that's how the state functions here. Armenia, it's an Armenian state, but it's a state it's a modern capitalist state, right? And I think in Kanar's article, right, she wrote it as vulgar neoliberalism, and I think that's a really good way to do it because it's kind of this like stunted, bastardized form of neoliberalism, and this the civil contract can't reckon with that, and I don't think that they will. So it will create opportunities for other things to take power. And I think about what you mentioned about the AI is so interesting because working in a university, it's kind of scary because students just totally dependent on it. Like they've given up writing, and there's studies about this too. It's not just in Armenia, everywhere. That's people have shorter attention spans. They can't read long form and stuff like that, and that hinders your ability to critically think and analyze the world, and makes you more likely to fall for simplistic things like fascism. Fascism does that. It provides us some very simple reason for why things are bad. Your life is shitty because of the Turks. Your life is bad because of black people, etc. Right? So like that's one of the big main dangers, let's say in the social sphere, but also because it's going to lead to joblessness, right? People are already losing their jobs because of AI. And then at the same time, it's also part of civil contracts propaganda, neoliberal propaganda about Armenia becoming a center of the tech world, right? And if Armenia has more economic power, it's going to be like super powerful, and Armenians are going to be more free and like all this stuff. But do we know how? I mean, I don't. I personally don't see that happening. They signed a deal with NVIDIA to build like this AI supercomputer and stuff like that. And like, sure, maybe research will go a long way, but is it going to really benefit like, the people living on the border to a super high extent? Is it gonna benefit like the person who is an engineer in the Soviet Union but is planting potatoes somewhere in Sunik? Like, I don't know that it will. So I think it's just a dangerous game that they're trying to present by saying like AI and tech is this magic bullet, when really I just think it's a transformation of capitalism from one form of like how it's transforming value into a new way, right? Like capitalism always has to create itself, renew itself, through constant accumulation. And AI, I think, is the next stage or the next way that capitalism, or let's say the tech revolution, maybe perhaps we could dub it. It might be the next way that capitalism finds a way to regenerate and renew itself, right? So, yeah.
Can I just say lately, whenever I hear any like claims from authorities, of any country, any context, of like, yeah, something will make you free. This is what will free the people or make these people free. I'm constantly thinking about, do you mean like cheaper labor? Like it will make them free, like fully free? Like it's like they're no longer even paid? That's where my mind goes. Like being free no longer means freedom like that. It means under sort of the context and the conditions we live in. I only hear it as, oh shit, like my labor is gonna be and my worth is gonna be absolutely like I'm just gonna have to give it away. It's not even gonna be like paid, you know? That's where my mind goes. And I don't think it's for no reason that it goes there, you know? I think that's where we're going more and more in many ways.
Yeah. Before we get off, and we've taken so much of your time already, Garren, we want to let you go soon, but we also do want to talk about emergent fascism. Maybe it's not emergent. I mean, this is a long history. In the diaspora, Armenians have many Armenians, and I've found out recently, have really clung to some fascist figures in the United States. And again, this goes against any self-interest. And it's been, for me, like quite shocking that this is that this is even like a reality for Armenian diaspora in the United States, probably also in Europe, who've clung to fascist forms. Wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think so I think like let's look at the Armenians, for example, in America and France, right? They're typically more middle class, they're more petit bourgeois, so they're a little more likely to be by virtue of their class, I think sometimes a bit more inclined to support conservatism, right? As a result of, like, let's say, assimilationist pressures on ethnic minorities like Armenians, who sometimes can pass white, sometimes they don't pass white, right? But nonetheless, that door is open for them if they want it, right? Because it's also a performative thing when it comes to whiteness, and part of that performance is uh, supporting conservative politics or like fascist politics. So, for example, the Armenians in LA, there was an article in the Guardian a couple of years ago about a big Armenian protest against LGBTQ literature in schools in Glendale, I think, right, or maybe in Pasadena. So that's one view, right? And at the same time, you have uh, the origins of Armenian kind of transnationalism, let's say, in the old centers of the diaspora, which up until the Lebanese Civil War was Beirut, right? And and the number one party that ruled Beirut was the Tashnaks, right? And their kind of ideology, which is conservative nationalism, right? It's been that way since the First World War. It also inculcates this kind of ethnic superiority, this kind of ethnic supremacism. I would say, which is mediated through history, Armenian history, or an Armenian conservative nationalist take on history through culture, dance, song, right, and all these things. And that gets transmitted to generations down the line, and it's still translated. The thing, as much as I am against and criticize them, it's somewhat admirable that they're still able to recruit people the way they do, and get people, right, and like have them dedicated, right. So like, and that's a problem, right? It's because institutions like Jansezian and the church and the way they work together and stuff, they have a monopoly over social life and cultural life amongst Armenians in the diaspora. Even though most Armenians, I think, in the US are non-affiliated, right? They're Chezok. They're not affiliated with any party, but still the ones that are politicized are loud and they're prominent, and they're involved too. So in Armenia, I mean in America, it's a special. It's interesting because a lot of it is tied to the genocide, and then the way the historicization of the genocide began to take place, because genocide, as we know as a term, was coined by Lemkin in the wake of the Holocaust, right? In 47, I think he termed it. And Armenian scholarship in America didn't really begin in earnest, I think, until the 50s, maybe, or the 60s. And that is when Armenian historians, like Armenian chairs, right, and like centers of study began to be established in America at places like the first three places were Harvard, UCLA, and Columbia, right? So elite institutions, and they were those chairs, endowed chairs as they're known, were created through campaigns, right, of like sometimes the different Armenian political parties coming together to fund these programs and come together, and also unaffiliated people for the discipline of Armenian history, which existed in some degree, thanks to people like Nina Garsoyan, who taught at Columbia and trained a lot of the generation of historians before us, right? And Sirar Garren Jansezian. Anyway, so those initial group of scholars, who were the children of genocide survivors, right? They wanted to historicize the genocide and in seeking recognition, right? Because this was a context where, especially in the 60s, after the 6 Day War, let's say, where Holocaust recognition began to be a very tangible part of public life in America, right? So Zolin Nalbandian has wrote about this, that Armenians had this thing called the recognition envy, right? They were seeing how they had to deal with their own pain, their own trauma, and their inability to talk about it because nobody else in the society cared or knew about what was going on. So that's one of the motivations, I think, that began as part of the scholarly effort to get the genocide recognized, okay? But this is also during the Cold War. So at this point, Turkey is a NATO ally of America. America is not going to recognize the genocide and compromise relations with a NATO ally in Turkey, right? Where there's a big NATO base and stuff like that, right? And something peculiar then happened I think it's 1975, when a gentleman named Garren Jansezian, I believe is his name, who was a genocide survivor. He was a kid when the genocide occurred, and at that point in 72, he was an old man. He invited two Turkish diplomats in Los Angeles on the premise of selling them some art from the Ottoman period. And then once they came, he shot them. He shot and killed them. Okay, so this is the first. Since the days of Operation Nemesis, when Soghomon Tellerian killed Talat Pasha and stuff, this was the first time that armed responses to genocide and revenge for the genocide took place, right? Since that time, in that interlude period of the Second World War, and the First and Second World War, and it kind of breathed life into the generation of Armenians who grew up in the Middle East, who were disaffected, whose cultural life was again mediated by these parties who were talking about Armenia, the homeland, the genocide and stuff like that. But this generation of radicals, they rejected the inertia and the conservatism of the parties, because a key thing of Armenian identity is martyrdom, right? And going out and dying for the cause, right? For the high tad, right? And this is why we celebrate a battle that we lost, the Battle of Avarad, right? And so they were criticizing the parties for not acting on this stuff, right? And that generation, discontent, right? This is the era of decolonization. This is the era of the Palestinians, and the PLO and the PFLP and like airplane hijackings and all this stuff. And out of that discontent generation is where Asala came. Okay. And Asala, as a result of their actions, okay, their very first action, by the way, this is very interesting. Their very first action was a bombing of like a worldwide church organization or something, because they claimed that it was encouraging Armenians to emigrate to the United States and leave the Middle East and leave their homeland. Okay. And the name of their group, they had like, the so and so revolutionary squad. And the first one was named after that old Armenian gentleman who assassinated those Turkish diplomats. I'm not saying this romantically. I'm just like trying to, and so once they started doing things, right, they were like doing activities, like they were attacking Turkish diplomatic staff, attaches, stuff like that. All of a sudden, the Armenian genocide became part of the international agenda. Okay, it became part of people's public consciousness, because they're like, who are these Armenians? Like, they have communiques, they have things like this. They had a radio, they had a daily radio in Beirut and stuff like that. Like they had media, they had books and stuff like that, right? I have an example of a book actually here that has a lot of their sorry, it's kind of blurred right now, but it has examples of like the pamphlets and the patches they would say like, we're against Zionism, anti-imperialist, stuff like that. Yeah, it's similar to that. And this was a strange situation, because by that period, okay, all of the like very like important historical work that the Armenian scholars were doing, okay, the Armenian scholars who were also part of the Armenian lobby, right, who the lobby at that time, the goal was to help Soviet Armenia, but also get genocide recognition. All the work that the scholars were doing paled in comparison to what Asala did in terms of getting genocide recognition as on the table, right, of conversation. So it kind of put them in this awkward position. And yeah, like so like the lobby was very respectable. They were at some point there was like, if you read like newspaper clippings and stuff like that, there was a huge debate where like many Armenians were like, listen, like we understand why they're doing this. They came from like a very like nuanced position, but the other ones were like, we have to condemn terrorism no matter what. Like, they were taking the kind of Cold Warrior position. And at the time, for example, the governor of California was an Armenian at the time in the 80s. Okay, in 82. He wrote a letter to the Reagan administration. This is all available online. He wrote a letter to the Reagan administration because there was a note that like a public document that came out that was like like the CIA's analysis of Armenian terrorism. And it was terrorism, Armenian terrorism, and it puts into question. It says like they're doing this because of the alleged genocide that occurred, right? So the Armenian lobby was, upset over this. So they wrote. So he wrote on behalf the governor of California. His name is George Dumekjian, I think. He wrote on behalf of the Armenian lobby to, have this corrected, basically. And the response of the administration was basically, listen, like we can't do it right now because we don't want to alienate Turkey. Okay, so like it shows you the limits of the lobby approach. But then, okay, Asala like crash and burned for obvious reasons. They started killing civilians, right? They started killing each other, and they were doing like, senseless things basically. And that kind of the sort of like, as problematic as it was, the potential that they represented for like Armenian radicalism that reached across and which is very important, right? They saw themselves as part of a movement. They saw themselves as separate, not just like a party, but like as a movement who was on the same wavelength, okay, as the Palestinians, as the Kurds, as the leftists in Turkey, right? Turkey was under a military rule at this time. So which is important to the next point, which is that in 1982, that same year, there was a conference called the International Conference on the Holocaust and Genocide, or on the Holocaust, I think. And Armenians were invited. Okay, I think there was like something like 100 or so workshops, but like I think five out of or so were them were Armenians. And once the Turkish government got a wind of this, they protested against this. Turkey was under military rule at the time. They protested. They lobbied the Israeli government to prevent the Armenians from coming. So the Israeli government tried to get the conference.
This was in Tel Aviv, right?
This conference was in Tel Aviv, right? And they were trying to get the government to cancel the conference, like, entirely. So what ended up happening was that Elie Wiesel, who was part of the conference, backed out, right? Because the Turkish government was threatening to maybe harm Turkish Jews, or like they said they couldn't guarantee the safety of Turkish Jews, let's say. And Yad Vashem, which is the official name of the Holocaust Memorial in Israel, also backed out and was against the conference for the inclusion of Armenians, right? And the delegation of Armenians, led by Richard Hovhannisyan, who helped start the Armenian Assembly of America, which is the second, one of the moderate lobbying groups. They kind of, in defiance of the Turkish government, went. But it was at the same time that that Israel had just invaded Lebanon. It was in the same month the conference was occurring. Okay, so it shows that within the logic of the lobby, right? It didn't matter. It didn't matter what was happening. They will pursue recognition of the genocide at all costs. Okay, now where the conservatism and the emergent fascism of the diaspora comes into play here is that you have to ask the question. They never stop to ask the question, what good is recognition from a white supremacist government? What good is recognition from a government that produces and threatens and blackmails the world population with nuclear bombs and attacks its own citizens with attack dogs and fire hoses and drone warfare and surveillance, right? So like, what good is recognition in that sense? Okay, so then it puts you in an automatically sort of conservative pull, because the genocide studies is very conservative. As an academic, Tamar, I know you know that it is a very conservative field. So yeah, it's like it cuts out the possibility of a radical alternative and just limits the horizon of Armenian political struggle to just lobbying to help the government or to get recognition, but it doesn't actually consider the kind of critical parameters of what that means, the implications of what that actually means, I think. And by the time Asala died out, 1988 happened, the earthquake happened, the Karabakh movement broke out, war broke out, right? And the lobby shifted its approach away from recognition towards supporting the newly independent Republic of Armenia. But since then, okay, and since 2016, or since, let's say, 2020, and as fascism has its global resurgence, right? So has the ideas, like the very ideas of this civilizational clash between Christianity and Muslims, or Christianity and immigrants and stuff like that. So America, as like a white republic, as like a Christian, as like the center of Judeo-Christian civilization, okay, many of the racists for them in government, the evangelical Christians and so forth, they view Armenia as on the front line of this war between this clash of civilizations. Okay, and this is very dangerous for us, because Armenians are like, yeah, like, we're culturally Christian, but they're not that religious, I think, But at the same time, we're unbeknownst to us, we're becoming soldiers for this clash, and it's very dangerous. So the lobby this is part of the emergent fascism. The lobby uh, is now trying to take cues from the Israeli lobby, right? Who correctly identified American evangelicals as a base for their support in the United States. Now, the Armenian lobby is trying to do the same thing. They're trying to get support from the hyper-conservative, very nationalistic, racist, evangelical Christians of the United States to get their support, regardless of what the evangelical Christians actually think about Armenia. They're trying to get their support, which is a very dangerous, slippery slope, because again, whereas the radicals of that previous generation were trying to, they were throwing the lot of the Armenians with the rest of the world, okay? This cause is very particular. The cause of genocide recognition is very particular and specific. It's not an attempt to take Armenians out of isolation, right? And we are isolated. A lot of it is self-imposed because we don't see ourselves as part of the same struggle as the Palestinians, for example, or as the Black Americans, for example. So that's a very dangerous position for us to be in, I would say.
Yeah, and thank you so much for laying it out that way. That's like a really good narrative, connecting actually genocide scholarship in Armenian studies to the way in which the Armenian petite bourgeoisie in the United States has clung itself to this white supremacist project. That's really fascinating. And Gerard Libaridian, he recently wrote in Precarious Armenia, and I don't agree with everything Libaridian says and does. But there's this interesting point that he makes, and I don't think it's laid out in quite the kind of materialist perspective that you just did. But there's a sense that Armenians are just really bad at, or I guess refuse really, to connect what is the Armenian cause to what is really the cause of colonized peoples around the world, and without some kind of I think he puts it in, and I heard this in an interview he gave about the book, of Armenians basically just demand that you should care about Armenian issues, and then if you don't, you hate Armenians, right?
Yeah.
And it's why should anyone care about Armenian issues, right, if they're not Armenian, right? And this is the refusal of an internationalism. I'm not necessarily condoning Asala. I'm not celebrating Asala. I think it's a really important history. But there is that sense of internationalism that we've lost. And when we were talking before we started recording, you were pointing out that the perplexing question, right, of why so few of us have spoken out about the genocide in Gaza, right? Why? Right? We are peoples who have many of us, not all of us, but many of us have descended from survivors of the genocide. So why is this not our issue? Why are we not? Right? And I think it has everything to do with what you just laid out.
Even some of the writings about the campaign to save the Armenian quarter in Jerusalem, for example. Even some of that, actually, I would suggest that you have one of the gentlemen from that group on the podcast, because he's very good. But some of the writing from outside about it, doesn't connect Israeli apartheid and Armenians at all. It's just this disconnected thing that's happening in the Armenian quarter. And that's it's a disservice to what's happening, I think, first of all. But yeah, Now, I don't want to give so much away because I really want to get this article published, but I interviewed Girard because he was one of those people who refused to go. He was invited to go to that conference. Him and Ron Sunni were both invited to go, and they refused. Ron wrote about it in his book, They Can Live in the Desert But Nowhere Else. And I emailed both of them about it, and they responded, and they're like, yeah, we refuse to go. And then I talked to them about it, and Girard wrote a brilliant article in the Armenian Weekly about it back in 1982. So I was able to get a scan of that, and it's such a prescient critique because they basically just straight up say, how can you be against genocide but then ignore the fact that the host country you're in is committing massacres next door, right? So and then there's of course all the temporal stuff, right? Like September 19th occurred, okay, and then October 7th happened a couple weeks after, and then Israel began with Azerbaijani oil, okay, has been fueling the genocide, okay, and Israeli weapons and surveillance technology armed the Azerbaijanis, right? They have a very um, similar, and like, they're sort of strange bedfellows, right?
And then they used Qarabağ as a pad from which to fire drones on Iran with. So
Yeah.
it's like, how
I
is
didn't
it
know that.
in any
Yeah.
way, like in any way, are we as Armenians giving any space to Israeli claims, to Israeli history, to Israeli
Mhm.
narratives on anything
Mhm.
is
Mhm.
beyond me. Yeah. Maybe we close it off here. We've kept you for a really, really long time.
Yeah, I can keep going. It's not. I mean, if you want to ask about the birthright stuff, if not, we can do a part two. But I don't want to. I know you two have stuff to do too. So, but
I think actually, I would really like to talk about birthright, and this is something I've been thinking about a lot. So let's do another episode on birthright. We're making a note of that. That will be
perfect.
one of our episodes coming up.
Great, great. Well, thank you so much for having me on. I'm honestly like, I was really delighted when I first learned about the existence of the podcast, and I think it's something very timely, desperately needed, and it's important that people like Gayane, Avazian Sona from the last episode, that people like that are known to the Armenian world, I think, and the world at large too. So I'm really honored also to be on the podcast, and happy to talk more, you know.
It's been a pleasure having you, Garren. I learned a lot actually. So I appreciate it. Thank
Me
you.
too.
Yes, thank you.
Me too. I learned a whole lot, and I'm sure that our audience will too. Our audience, who at this point has definitely liked and subscribed to our channel, or followed us on Spotify, where you can also find us, left comments and rated us, give us 5 stars. And thank you, Garren, so much. We'll look forward to having you on again. And a good night to you.
Thank you.
Bye bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.